a pleasure to be here with you as we are continuing our second class with Rabbi Johnny Solomon. And the topic is Rabbi Jonathan Sacks' spiritual biography. It is my pleasure to welcome Rabbi Solomon, who joins us, and he will now be giving us this second class.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi Fishman. Thank you, all of you. Lovely to see you. I hope you can now see my slideshow. Is that visible to everybody? Just nod if that is. Wonderful. And I hope you can hear me well. And I hope you're all well. Last night was Lag BaOmer. We are now moving rapidly towards Shavuot. And it seems very, very appropriate to start spending time reflecting on one of Torah's great leaders of the modern age, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks. Last week, we spoke about identity, Rabbi Sacks on identity. And as was just explained by Rabbi Fishman, this isn't just Rabbi Sacks's teachings on identity. It was about how his teachings tell us a little bit about him. So this is a spiritual biography. So today, what I want us to do is talk about Rabbi Sacks on self-belief, both the teachings he wrote about self-belief and what those teachings say about his self-belief. As we did last time, I'll be pausing. If there are any questions or queries, feel free to ask, either unmute yourself or write in the chat. But with that, let's begin. And just before I turn to our first slide, I didn't bother to count the amount of degrees, honorary degrees that Rabbi Sacks has. But suffice to say, Rabbi Sacks was a remarkable scholar, a remarkable leader, a remarkable speaker. He wrote over 40 books and was acclaimed around the world. We wouldn't be talking about him the way we do were that not to be the case. And the reason I wish to stress that is to us now understand what we're about to read. Because Rabbi Sacks said, and he didn't say it when he was 12 or when he was 15, he said this less than 2 years before he died. He said, I have a persistent lack of belief in myself. Now, before we go on, I want to say that again. One of the world's greatest modern philosophers, certainly one of Judaism's greatest leaders in the modern age, an industrious author, an outstanding speaker, and he says, I have a persistent lack of belief in myself. I remember when I first read this, I said, excuse me? If you're lacking belief in yourself, tell me who's going to have belief in himself. But there's a reason for me sharing this. Obviously, this is itself autobiographical. This is him being interviewed and responding. And he says, I have a persistent lack of belief in myself. He says there's some kind of pain, which is perhaps an inherited thing. There's a sadness in Jewish music, a kind of minor key that I heard when I was 2 or 3 years old. It's an existential sadness I can't eliminate, however hard I try. He says that's probably what allows me to communicate with people who are unhappy. Before we go on, I find this to be so tender, so raw, so vulnerable. Rabbi Sacks is saying, and as I say, he mentioned this just within 2 years of his death. He lacked belief in himself. He often felt a certain sadness. And that's how he felt he was able to communicate, especially to people who felt low or sad or vulnerable or depressed. We often don't think of Rabbi Sacks that way. We think of him as being this audacious leader. But what we're going to learn is that audacity came from going on a journey.
Maybe they sent it to like a little post office nearby.
Sorry, so that somebody's a little unmuted, and if you are unmuted, try not to be on somebody else's call. Right. So I hope you realize how significant this statement is. and why it's so important to understand this about Rabbi Sacks, because if you know this about Rabbi Sacks, it's going to change the way you hear what he writes. You won't think that he's a guy who always kind of skipped with his step. Instead, you'll appreciate that this is somebody who suffered from self-doubt and yet who was able to somewhat overcome that. And he explains here, and we're going to be quoting a few other teachings on this topic, how he was able to overcome that. Because he says, Elaine, his wife, is a balance in everything. When I was going through difficult times as chief rabbi, she was stable. It's not easy being the child of somebody in the public eye, and she was a source of strength and confidence that our 3 children needed. Elaine is joyous, positive, always finding the good in people. She is the world's finest antidepressant. Not only is it beautiful what he says about his wife Elaine, but it's also telling about what it says concerning him. Until he married, Rabbi Sacks felt this minor key of his life. Until he met Elaine, he was somebody who doubted himself, and even that continued. But with her voice in his life, he was able to gain some measure of self-belief. With her voice in his life, as somebody who perhaps felt depressed or low, he was able to be boosted. He was able to see the joy in the world. We're going to be having a session on Rabbi Sacks in joy. But if you appreciate this, you'll know that the reason he was so interested in happiness and joy is precisely because it didn't come naturally to him. It was almost an innovation that he encountered when he first met Elaine, and something that inspired him for the rest of their days together. Any thoughts just before we continue to explore Rabbi Sacks on self-belief? Because, as I say, this is a very, very powerful window into his soul. Any thoughts about this? Does this surprise anybody? Everyone's being very quiet. I can tell you it surprised me. Certainly somebody saying this so starkly, but I appreciate him doing so, because it means each of us, and this counts me as well, who lack self-belief, each of us who sometimes suffers from moments of sadness, each of us who sometimes isn't sure about who they are and the contribution they're making, they say, well, if that was how Rabbi Sacks was, well, I don't mind being in that club. So what we're going to now do is study a number of teachings of Rabbi Sacks, or remarks and teachings, on this topic of self-belief, both the feeling of lacking and the pursuit of self-belief, and how one does that. Now, he says, and this is in the introduction to morality, he says, the most important person in my life is my wife, Elaine. This year, we will celebrate our golden wedding. I tried to explain in my TED talk, he gave a TED talk in 2017, what drew me to Elaine in the first place, the fact that she was unlike me as possible. He says, I was earning graduate qualifications in self-doubt and existential angst. She was radiating joy. Hence my theory, which is a summary of the book Morality, namely, it's the people not like us who make us grow. Now, not only has he told you what the book Morality is about, not only has it continued to tell us about his love for Elaine, what this informs us is, actually, there are people who doubt themselves, who can become transformed by people different to them. And that can bolster them, that can lift them, that can change them. If Rabbi Sacks or Jonathan Sacks at that time didn't meet Elaine, we wouldn't be talking about him. He would have still been brilliant, but he would not have been able to lift us with the words that he did, because he wouldn't have learned the art of lifting, of inspiring. He would have struggled to understand what joy was in the fullest sense of the word. The self-doubt, the questioning of himself perhaps would have been too great. So this tells us a lot about self-belief, which is it doesn't just come from within the self. We oftentimes need other people to believe in us, for us to develop that measure of self-belief. And this, by the way, was a major message in morality, where he has a whole chapter dedicated to self-help books, and where he says, for the major things in life, you can't just help yourself, you need other people. And which was the other person, in particular, but not limited to, that he needed to find himself. This was his beloved wife, Elaine. Okay, now, having reflected on that, let me quote to you from Rabbi Dr. Joshua Berman, who was a student of Rabbi Sacks for many years. And when Rabbi Sacks died, Rabbi Berman wrote a piece about his teacher, which I found to be very, very significant. And so these are the words of Rabbi Berman about Rabbi Sacks, saying, most of us suffer from what psychologists call a negativity bias. Criticisms have a greater impact on us than do compliments. This is a theme, by the way, that Rabbi Sacks himself addresses many times. Our default thinking, especially when facing the unknown, is to focus on what we're bad at, our weaknesses, where we're likely to fail and what threats we face. Our self-doubt blinds us to reality. We beat ourselves up before we even get out of the gate by talking ourselves out of things that could have turned out well. Rabbi Sacks once said that the key to his perseverance was marrying somebody who believes in you and you just keep going. That keep going allowed a dynamic to ensue. Confidence is linked to doing, which offers proof of success that can shut down our self-doubt. So this is, by the way, a very, very beautiful, eloquent description of the journey of those with self-doubt. But it's also a window into who Rabbi Sacks was. Somebody who doubted himself, somebody who second-guessed himself to the point that he thought he may not be able to be the person that others perhaps thought he could be. And it was that encouragement from Elaine in particular that made all the difference. And you can imagine, and this is the case, that when Rabbi Sacks analyzes that passage in the beginning of Sefer Shemot, the book of Exodus, where Moshe doubts himself, when God says, Moses, be the leader, and Moses says, I'm not so sure that I can do that. Rabbi Sacks isn't just talking about Moses. Rabbi Sacks hears in the words of Moses a little bit of himself, where he initially was encouraged to take the baton of leadership. We spoke about that last time when he met with the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And though certainly he rose even greater to that challenge, there was somewhat of an inner tug of war, reminiscent of that of Moses, that of self-doubt, that lacking of self-belief, which is why if you actually look at the personal biography and the spiritual biography of Rabbi Sacks, it is marriage to Elaine which changes him. It's when he's able to hear the joy, when he's able to gain that confidence. As he says, marrying somebody who believes in you, you just keep going. From then on, he just kept going. Now, this now comes not from Rabbi Berman, but from Rabbi Sacks himself. Judaism's life-changing ideas, a brilliant book, essays on the parasha, each concluding with a life-changing idea. And here he again speaks autobiographically. And he says, there may be times in our lives, certainly there have been in mine, when the sun disappears and we enter the cloud of black despair. I mean, this is powerful for Rabbi Sacks to be bearing his soul in that way. He's telling his readers, there have been times in my life where I've been in the cloud of black despair. You may lose heart. But, and this is a point that he taught us. It's a point that he taught us because it's a point that he lived according to. We may lose heart. God never will. We may despair. God will give us hope. By the way, the word hope is a key word in the teachings of Rabbi Sacks. Hope is a key word of Judaism for Rabbi Sacks. But hope is also the key contribution that we get from God. God gives us hope. God believes in us even if we don't believe in ourselves. He says this time after time after time. You may sin and disappoint and come short again and again, but God never ceases to forgive us when we fail and lift us when we fall. Have faith in God's faith in us, and you'll find the path from darkness to light. You know, this is a kind of teaching which I genuinely believe could be on a kitchen wall, on the front of the refrigerator, stuck in your car, wherever you want it, in your office. This is a kind of teaching that we should each read once a day. Truth be told, so many of Rabbi Sacks' teachings are, because it's deep. It wrestles with those emotions that so many of us wrestle with. It acknowledges difficulty. It teaches us about faith in God, God's faith in us, and that's the faith we should have in ourselves. Before we proceed further, does anybody have any thoughts about what we've learned so far, what I've shared about perhaps this quote or others that we've looked at? Pause for a moment in case anybody does.
I would like to say something.
Please.
It's the first time that I am learning about Dr. Sacks. I've heard so much about him, and he's been held in such awe, but I'm shocked to hear about his private life and his private thoughts. But I'm also, what's the word? Enlightened by the fact that he's human. He's a human being, and he's kind of, I guess, like everyone else, he's got pluses and minuses to them.
So thank you for sharing. I think it's surprising, maybe shocking perhaps is a stronger word, but by being vulnerable to his readers, what actually Rabbi Sacks was showing is that he had a connection to those who listened to him, who read his ideas. He felt he could trust us as readers. Now, you may well know that he was chief rabbi until 2013, and then basically was kind of this global religious voice until 2020. And his tone changes after 2013. He is undoubtedly a little bit freer in how he self-expresses. He feels a little bit more comfortable showing these vulnerabilities. I think for him, he always wanted to, but he wasn't quite sure whether this kind of undermined this title called chief rabbi. But after 2013, when he retired being chief rabbi and continued as a global teacher, an author, etc., he committed himself to sharing a little bit more because he felt it was important for the world to understand the reality of the ups and downs in life. By the way, one of his spiritual mentors, Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, himself did this. He spoke about his challenges, his frustrations, his emotions, and there's something actually very healthy about it. Rabbi Sacks himself emphasizes, this isn't one of the quotes, but I'm happy to send it to you, that what makes the Bible, the Tanakh, so special is we encounter the biblical characters in a very, very raw sense. We talk about their strengths and their weakness. And I think Rabbi Sacks felt a certain weight lifted from his shoulders when he felt more confident to do so after he retired being chief rabbi. And so it's certainly in his later books We find a little bit more of these remarks with later interviews. But yes, knowing that these are the things that he was experiencing, I think helps a lot of people. I help people, I give spiritual coaching sessions with people, and when I share some of these ideas, it creates a connection. It helps people feel understood.
Yes.
As he mentioned himself, the very fact that he was able to connect to people who are perhaps a little bit more towards the melancholy is reflective of his own personal journey. And the more he spoke, he would say, I can talk to a crowd of thousands, but I struggle to speak to a group of 3. He was actually somebody who negotiated different groups in different ways. And similarly, like all of us, negotiated different emotions in different ways. Any quick thoughts before we proceed? Okay, so I'm just going to move on. And what I want to do now is quote from a different student of Rabbi Sacks, because again, here too, what he does is provide a very profound insight about what it means to be a disciple of Rabbi Sacks and how Rabbi Sacks applied the lessons he taught in real life. Meaning what made Rabbi Sacks so special is not only did he teach ideas, but he lived according to the ideas he taught. We just read before how we need to all recognize that God believes in us even when we don't believe in ourselves. So this is what Sam Liebens wrote not long after Rabbi Sacks died. Rabbi Sacks said that his life was shaped by a handful of people who believed in him more than he believed in himself. We spoke about that last week. Rabbi Sacks certainly believed in me, says Rabbi Dr. Samuel Liebens, more than I believe in myself. And that faith he had in me continues to inspire me to strive to be better. Moreover, his faith in me was just an expression of the faith that he knew God to have in every person. Isn't that deep? Rabbi Sacks strongly believed that God believed in every person. And because God believes in every person, then surely we should do the same. So though he lacked self-belief on occasions, he was inspired and comforted by God and inspired and lifted by his wife. And so what did he do? He didn't pass on the self-doubt. What he did was he reassured others. I believe in you. And those sentiments lifted so many people, myself included. So he took a theology of God believing in us, lived it, practiced it, and passed it on. So I find this to be very moving. And again, I can speak personally. This is what he did for all those who are fortunate to meet Rabbi Sacks. This is what Rabbi Sacks did to all those who are fortunate to call themselves his disciples. Now, the question though is, are we all so great? Are we all so capable? I mentioned Rabbi Sacks being this brilliant scholar, but I'm not him. And most of us have not published 40 books or whatever. Most of us have not given a TED talk. Most of us have, etc., etc. So it's all very well and good talking about how God believes in us. But what does that actually mean in practice? And Rabbi Sacks explains as follows. Not all of us can paint like Monet or compose like Mozart, but we each have gifts, capacities that can lie dormant throughout life until someone awakens them. We can achieve heights of which we never thought ourselves capable. All it takes is for us to meet someone who believes in us, challenges us, and then when we have responded to the challenge, blesses and celebrates our achievement. He's not just talking in theory. He's talking about the Lubavitcher Rebbe to him. He's not just talking in theory. He's talking about the kind of things he would do for his disciples, like Rabbi Dr. Joshua Berman and Rabbi Dr. Samuel Liebens. He's also talking about what his wife Elaine was able to add to his life, when she believed in him, all it takes is for us to meet someone, sometimes just one person, who believes in us, challenges us, and blesses us for us to then to achieve. Sometimes all it takes is one person. We forget the impact that one encounter can have, one person can have, to changing your life forever. But if you want to see it in practice, look at Rabbi Sacks. Look at the impact of Elaine on him. Look at the impact of the Lubavitcher Rebbe on him. Look at the impact of him on others. And you see those singular encounters making the greatest of difference. You see one life being touched by another. How a person who grew to learn about what it means to be gifted was able to bless others, to help them discover their own gifts. Any thoughts about this teaching? We're going to be exploring this idea of uniqueness of a person's natural gifts in a moment. If not, then we're going to proceed. As mentioned, we're now going to move on to discuss uniqueness. And he says each of us is unique. Even genetically identical twins are different. By the way, I have genetically identical twins. They're about to celebrate their bat mitzvah. So even genetically identical twins are different. There are things only we can do. We who are what we are in this time, this place, and these circumstances. For each of us, God has a task, work to perform, a kindness to show, a gift to give, love to share, loneliness to ease, pain to heal, or broken lives to help mend. Discerning that task, hearing God's call, is one of the great spiritual challenges for each of us. You know, we think about Abraham and Sarah hearing the call of God, Lech lecha, go and travel, which the Hasidic teachers explain, Lech lecha, go and find yourself. Rabbi Sacks teaches us that each of us are beckoned to find ourselves, to find a spiritual challenge set before us, to understand that each of us have gifts, each of us is unique, each of us are placed in a time and a place where we can make a difference. To do so, we often need one or maybe more people to believe in us. But once they help us realize what we can do, and once upon reflecting on the Almighty, we realize that God has faith in us even when we don't have faith in ourselves, we're able to make that difference. So what is spiritual meditation? It is what he says at the end here, to discern that task, to hear God's call. That is to spiritually meditate. That's what we're all called upon to do. To establish, to figure out, to identify what that great spiritual challenge for each of us is. You know, I've called this series a spiritual biography, and oftentimes people think, Rabbi Sacks, when you think about him, he's more of an intellectual. Is he really a spiritual leader? My response is, you betcha. Look what he's saying here. In a book titled Studies in Spirituality, he's setting before us the great spiritual challenge for each of us. It's one that speaks to every single one of us because every single one of us is unique. We can't be Rabbi Sacks, and we shouldn't attempt. Our task is to be us. What made him a great leader is whenever he met people, he didn't try to make them carbon copies of him. He tried to encourage each person to identify what their unique gifts were, and he blessed them to realize them. Does anybody have any thoughts about this idea? Does it speak to you? Did you ever have somebody who was able to challenge you, task you with that duty? Lech lecha, find yourself. This is what Rabbi Sacks was telling us. If you have any thoughts, feel free to write in the chat. wait a moment in case anybody wants to offer some thoughts. Okay. Let's see a similar teaching. For each of us, God may have a task, work to perform, a kindness to show, a gift to give, love to share, loneliness to ease, pain to heal, or broken lives to help mend. You can see it. He's saying this. Discerning that task, hearing God's call, gives a life meaning and purpose. Now, this is a line that he coined earlier on, and he repeated many times. Where we want to do what meets what needs to be done, that is where God wants us to be. You can say that again to yourself. Where what we want to do meets what needs to be done, that is where God wants us to be. Once you're at that moment, know that that's where you should be. In fact, Rabbi Sacks himself, and there's a video about this where he speaks about himself. He says, there was a point when I didn't want to be a rabbi. Sure, that work needed to be done, but I didn't necessarily know that that's who I needed to be. He says, and then I met the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And from that point on, I realized that that was my task. From that point on, he realized that that was his calling. Sharon, thank you so much. His words are so inspirational and helpful. I agree. Not a day goes by when I don't quote something of Rabbi Sacks, because they speak so deeply to us in the modern age. They speak from a place of wisdom. They speak from a place of spirituality. They're profound. They're gorgeous. And I hope you received the presentation from last time, and this too will be sent to you after this session. Each one of these quotes are gems. Take them, put them everywhere, because they can transform a life. They've certainly transformed mine. Now, we have a little bit more time. And so I want to talk about a word which perhaps wouldn't be understood if we only saw this quote, but certainly is now understood when you realize that Rabbi Sacks did doubt himself many times. Remember he said, I lack self-belief. What happens when you lack self-belief? Well, sometimes you wonder, what's the point of you? Sometimes you wonder whether you're up to the challenge, whatever been set before you. Alternatively, even if you're not so much overcome with self-doubt, he mentioned that there were times where he suffered more from depression. He sometimes felt very misunderstood. What that means is that Rabbi Sacks was, in some measure, lonely. Now, I mentioned one of Rabbi Sacks' spiritual mentors, Rabbi Joseph Ber Soloveitchik. You may be aware that one of his major contributions is an essay titled The Lonely Man of Faith. Rabbi Sacks didn't speak about this that often, but he did on a couple of occasions. And he says, when we feel alone, we are not alone, because the great heroes of the human spirit felt this way at times. Moses, David, Elijah, and Jonah. So did modern masters like Rav Kook and Rabbi Soloveitchik. It was precisely their loneliness that allowed them to develop a deeper relationship with God. Plumbing the depths, they reached the heights. They met God in the silence of the soul and felt themselves embraced. Now, just for you to know, in this essay titled, I Believe, Rabbi Sacks, he says, there have been times when I felt alone. And he identifies with these biblical leaders, Moses, David, Elijah, and Jonah, as well as with people like Rabbi Kook and Rabbi Soloveitchik, who often felt that people couldn't understand them. For Rabbi Sacks, he lived in different worlds. The university scholars didn't understand his faith, and some of the faith leaders he met didn't understand his scholarship. He was somebody who believed that doubt does not negate faith. He was somebody who, as we mentioned, lacked self-belief. So there were moments when he felt just very misunderstood. There were moments when he felt very spiritually lonely. True, Elaine was a great comfort. Still, there were times where even those around him, even those he absolutely adored, couldn't necessarily fully probe what was going on inside him. But what he says here, and it's so, so profound, is sometimes we can harness those feelings to deepen our faith. It was precisely their aloneness that allowed them to develop a deeper relationship with God. Plumbing the depths, they reached the heights. They met God in the silence of the soul and felt themselves embraced. I don't think he's just talking about Moses and David and Elijah and Jonah or Rav Kook and Rabbi Soloveitchik. I think he's talking about himself. I think Rabbi Sacks met God in the silence of his soul and felt himself embraced. And it's that belief in a personal God who loves us, belief in that personal God who believes in us more than we believe in ourselves, which encouraged him, which lifted him. This isn't just biographical, it is autobiographical. He's telling us a lot about himself. I've just received a question which is a little bit more specific. Perhaps I'll leave my email address afterwards, and whoever wishes to can ask me that after the session, but more than happy to do that. What we see here is somebody who took God seriously, and these are the words of Rabbi Sacks, but somebody who sometimes questioned himself. So self-belief is something that doesn't always come naturally. It's something that can come when others believe in us. This is what happened to Rabbi Sacks. This is how he became that great global leader. He replicated the self-belief that others had in him, made others believe in themselves, just like Rabbi Dr. Lieben said. Now let's come to our final slide, because in these few lines, you see a profound summary of what we've discussed. People must wrestle with themselves, says Rabbi Sacks, throwing off the person they might like to be but are not. They must accept that some people will like them and what they stand for, while others will not. They must understand that it is better to seek the respect of some than the popularity of all. This may involve a lifetime of struggle, but the outcome is an immense strength. No one is stronger than the person who knows who and what he is. Now, as chief rabbi, some people loved some of the things he was doing, and some people challenged him. You may even know that one of his books was banned by some religious leaders. They felt it was too out there. It was too controversial. He amended it, but the key point is the Rabbi Sacks had to know who he was, and he acknowledged that some people said, I get that, and some people said, I don't. And this is where self-belief comes in. If you don't believe in yourself, if others don't believe in you, if you don't believe that God believes in you, then when those judgments come, when those remarks come along, when that attempt to kind of cancel people, then you get crushed. But if you know who you are, if you believe in who you are, if there are people around you who believe in you, if you know that God believes in you even more than you believe in yourself, then you can wrestle with yourself. You can accept who you are. You can believe in your calling. That is deep. What that tells us is the self-belief that Rabbi Sacks was able somewhat to foster gave him that strength to know who and what he was. This self-belief enabled Rabbi Sacks to say, this is me. Rabbi Sacks clearly knew who and what he was, because over time he realized there was something about him. Over time he realized he had gifts. Over time he realized that he was unique in a time and a place. Over time he realized that he had a unique opportunity to make a difference. So what I want us to do is just summarize what we've gone through, because all of this is so important. We mentioned at the beginning that Rabbi Sacks had a persistent lack of belief in himself, but his wife, Elaine, was able to be the counterbalance to that. He mentions that when he began and he was in university, he was earning a graduate qualification in self-doubt and existential angst. But he met her and she radiated joy and she made him grow. Rabbi Dr. Berman tells us, this is what I learned from my teacher. Marry somebody who believes in you and you'll just keep on going. And he did. He says, yes, there are moments when the cloud of black despair comes along and we may doubt ourselves, but God doesn't doubt us. God believes in us. And that's crucial. And says Rabbi Dr. Samuel Liebens, not only did Rabbi Sacks think that himself about himself, but he passed it on. He passed on the belief he had in his disciples. He said, we can't always be like the other artists. We're not trying to live somebody else's life. But we need to know that we have the ability to make a difference as we are. We need to celebrate our uniqueness. We need to hear God's call in fulfilling our task in this world. Where what we want to do meets what needs to be done, that is where God wants us to be. He says, yes, there are moments you can feel alone. You can feel misunderstood. But even in that, you can meet God in the silence of the soul and you can feel yourself embraced. He says, and don't try and be somebody else. You may need to wrestle and struggle to figure out who you are. But he says, identifying that question. The outcome is an immense strength because no one is stronger than the person who knows who and what he is. And this too is autobiographical. This too tells us so much about Rabbi Sacks. Now, what you see from here is that Rabbi Sacks was this remarkable thinker. He was somebody who struggled and was lifted. He was somebody who, over time, was prepared to bare his soul, to help others feel understood. He was unique as a rabbi. He blended both Jewish knowledge and secular studies. Some people didn't understand that, or some people didn't approve of that. We can see from what he shared here, what we've learned last time, or what we're going to be seeing in future weeks, that this gave him a strength. He realized that this is what made him unique. He's able to bridge worlds and celebrate worlds together, speak many cultural languages. And sure, that may well have highlighted that sense of loneliness, but it also led to him being that great Jewish leader, that great spiritual leader that we're now talking about. So, are there any questions, thoughts, feedback of what I've said? Feel free to unmute yourself, write in the chat, whatever you wish. I'll give you a moment or two if you wish to do so. I'd love to hear your thoughts, both in terms of how you see Rabbi Sacks and also how you've processed these ideas and perhaps maybe considering them in terms of your own life. Anybody? No pressure? Let me just check the chat. But if that's the case, then it looks like we're going to be wrapping up in a minute. Just to remind you in terms of what we're doing in future weeks. Next week, we're going to be talking about Rabbi Sacks on failure, which you may think is, okay, well, today we talked about lacking self-belief, but for sure as heck, he wasn't a failure. Well, actually, this is a topic that really interested him because I think he felt that there were various projects that he did fail at. I'm going to be sharing some of them with you. On occasion, he wrote about this, or he spoke about this, his frustrations about not being able to succeed in certain areas of his rabbinate. So we're going to be talking about Rabbi Sacks on failure. Again, these are the, I wouldn't quite say uncut parts of Rabbi Sacks, but these are lesser known, the spiritual biography. And I think it's important to know that. It's important to know that he had days when he thought, oh, that's annoying, because sometimes we do too. We'll then speak about Rabbi Sacks on joy, and we're going to be focusing not exclusively on, but certainly significantly on his relationship with his wife, Elaine, because his relationship with happiness and joy is rooted in his relationship with Elaine, because without her, he couldn't understand happiness and joy. And he makes that very, very clear. And then we're going to be spending our last session talking about Rabbi Sacks on spirituality. Okay, so we've mentioned that word, but what does spirituality mean in terms of Rabbi Sacks, and what does he think that term should mean in terms of the Jew in the modern world? It's often misunderstood, so he's going to help us, and he's going to share it within a few lines. He's going to define something which, you know, series of books are unable to explain. This is a genius of Rabbi Sacks. Sometimes in just a few short words, he was able to distill ideas and explain them so clearly. He was a master teacher. So that is that. Just for those who wrote questions which are much more kind of pertinent to one-to-one messages, let me just share with you my email address if you wish to be in contact with me. And I'm putting this in the chat. So if that's the case, that's my email address. You can always, of course, contact me through Rabbi Fishman as well. And I'll be sharing this presentation with Rabbi Fishman, who will be passing it on to you as and when. I hope that's okay with you. It's been a great pleasure. And I wish you a great week, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Okay? Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Take care, Rita. Bye. Bye, all.